Morning everyone, welcome to the public board session of NHS Direct NHS Trust for June. I have a couple of apologies. Brian Gaffney, who's our medical director, is not available today. Louise Dillner, Steve Duncan, our non-executive directors, held up on their journeys, so on their way and likely to arrive anytime now. And Ruth Rankin, who looks as if she's not here, is actually here on the phone.
Yeah.
Ruth, are you with us?
Yes, Joanne, I am.
Brilliant. Okay. So Ruth, if you want to say something, you'll have to sort of shout because
That's fine. I'm used to that.
Okay, good. All right. Fine. Thank you. This board meeting doesn't have a particular burden of substantive items. Hi, Louisa. Hi, Steve. Oh, well, perfect. We're literally starting at this moment. Welcome to both of you. So our board agenda isn't particularly heavy today. I think most of the important substance is going to be in the Chief Executive's report. I've had no declarations of interest. Are there any to be made now? No? Okay. So perhaps we could look first at the minutes of previous meetings. So we've got board meetings and special minutes from finance committees and records of special action by the board. So shall we just progress through those with relative speed, starting with the minutes of the board from last time, which was 28th of May. Are there any comments on or matters of accuracy in the board minutes from May?
Sue, it's a question, it might be accurate, but on 7.3, the first bullet point, so the board welcomed the new KPIs such as B13 time of patients. Is that a new one?
It's a new definition.
Oh, it's a new definition, okay, right.
Perhaps we could just
Tweak that. Yeah,
refine
yes.
that one.
Because I think we were talking about the other sort of productivity ones, weren't we? But it's a new definition.
Yes, and maybe we could highlight one of them also for the minutes.
Yes.
One of the ones that's genuinely
Genuinely
new,
new.
which I'm sure Keith can advise you on, Keisha or Trevor.
Yeah.
Okay, nothing else then? Let's then go on to, so are we going to do some more minutes now, or shall we go to the action log and then come back? We're not going to do more minutes now, or
Minutes are way down.
those come later. Okay, that's fine. It would help if I was looking at the right page on my agenda, which I will now skip to. Great. Okay, action log then. Nick, relatively straightforward, I think.
So I think, yeah, Keith, it was a question of how many staff we think will be affected by kind of relatively last minute changes in terms of 4 weeks notice.
Yeah, so the answer is 0. So we've now built 5 periods of rosters and we've not invoked any changes to any staff. All 5 bills have followed standard principles and we've not changed any shift days off or roster colours for people. The exception to that is obviously what we do for bank holidays, which is outside of normal practice. To date, we've not yet seen any significant change in demand profile to warrant needing to make such changes.
And are we telling staff that? I mean, are we using the news shot? Because I imagine that's something that people are worrying about. And then I don't know whether any individual member of staff would know that not only have they not had their shift changed, but nobody has had their shift changed with less than 4 weeks
I think
notice.
that's something where I'll work with the internal communications team.
Just to reassure people. I mean, obviously we're not able to make promises for the future, but just so people get a sense of what's happening.
Yes.
I think that might be helpful. Yeah?
Good idea.
Should we do that?
Yep.
Okay.
Our future workforce, there are a couple of issues which will come back to the next meeting, although I would say that we're getting to the stage now with the flexible working requests where I'm being asked to authorise implementation of the outcomes, and the rule of thumb that I'm working to is that provided we have less than 50, then I will be giving that approval, and that's in line with what the board's view was.
There's not an absolute number, is there?
No, but
Just thought I mentioned it.
it's a rule of thumb. But I'm mentioning it because I'm on the cusp
In your-
of making that decision on the basis of information very recently received. So, but we will give a full report in the July board meeting.
And our principle of equity between individuals is not being compromised. I think that's the important thing.
Yeah.
Very good. All right. Then we can move on to my engagement report. There were just a couple of small busy time.
Very busy.
Yes.
Is the
3 pages.
message from that. So, on the second page, the meeting with on the information strategy, which is very interesting, was actually held not in Richmond House but in the House of Lords. And the very final meeting, which was due to be a teleconference with Director of Ops and Performance at Midlands and East, has been postponed. So actually that one hasn't happened yet. But all the others happened. And interesting, busy period. Happy to take any questions or move on. Roger.
Chair, particularly interested in the information strategy for health and social care, and whether there was a sense that you were able to give a sense, or you got a sense from the meeting of any possibility for the involvement of NHS Direct, or an acknowledgement of the work that NHS Direct has done in this field?
NHS Direct was mentioned. I talked a bit about the need, when thinking about an information strategy, to be considering multi-channel. So not to be thinking about the web in isolation as a sort of, which I think was generally accepted.
Yeah.
It was a pretty good meeting actually, and I mean, it was just so much broader. There was a lot about patient records, but I can send you, and anybody who's interested, a write-up of that meeting, which has been created by the organisers.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll send that round. I think it was a pretty good.
Yeah.
It was a good meeting, and it's well written up, and a lot of interesting contacts were made at that meeting, which I'll be following up on.
Brilliant.
So you'll see more activity next month.
Thank you. Good.
Okay. Thanks. Well, let's move on then into the performance section of the agenda and the Chief Executive's report. Nick.
Thank you. So the first item, I think, is probably the most significant thing that's happened in the last month. As you'll see from my written report, we were notified on the 13th of June that Secretary of State had made a decision to allow clinical commissioning groups that applied and who met criteria that a central clinical panel would assess to slip the implementation date of 111 by up to 6 months. The implications for the 0845 service are really not yet known, in that the department isn't clear how much and to what extent it would want to commission the 0845 service for longer. And clearly that's a matter for some active discussion for us with the department, and I'm sure will be touched on in later parts of the meeting. But essentially we are facing a timetable which leads to the decommissioning of the 0845 service and taking the last call on the 21st of March, and that in the absence of plans to the contrary, we would start decommissioning that capability and that infrastructure in a pretty irreversible kind of way in September, and therefore it sets a pretty clear timescale for discussions about whether that capacity is needed beyond the end of March 2013. So and that's the most serious concern that I've got about it. I'm actually pleased and gave out a quote on behalf of the Trust to say that I thought the decision to take longer to plan and implement the 111 service was the right decision. So supportive, but it clearly has implications, and for some staff it means considered a further period of uncertainty until such time as we know the answers to, so what does this mean for the 0845 service? I think that's probably all I can say for certain at the moment, but clearly it's a matter of some active discussion with the department.
Can we just pause there before we go on to anything else in your report for just comments and questions? Trevor?
First of all, I agree with Nick's statement in this report that we need to respond positively to requests to extend the life of 0845. I do have concerns about our ability to maintain clinical standards. If a service is to close, and 0845 is to close, you would expect our clinical staff to be thinking about their futures. A lot will be transferring to new 111 providers. I have concerns if we are simply, without having a clear date of when 085 stops, how we just continue to roll it forward and maintain clinical standards if our staff are leaving. So I think we need to be absolutely clear before we agree that that's a sensible thing to do, to be absolutely clear we can maintain the high clinical standards we've got. I think it would be wrong for us to drop our clinical standards because of this. So I'm concerned about that uncertainty. The other thing that isn't clear, Nick, from your note, and I wonder whether you can give us more details, is how 085 would be funded after April next year. Our commissioner disappears, SHA disappears, clinical groups will have the NHS funding from the commissioning board. Has it been discussed? Because there'll be a double running cost of running 111 and 0845. So again, we need assurance around how that service would be funded before we agree we should do it.
I mean, either of us could take this, and I'm sure we say exactly the same thing. We have made very, very clear that clinical standards are non-negotiable, and the adequate funding would need to be agreed to maintain the service. So those two things are, whereas we absolutely are sending out positive messages about wanting to accommodate their needs, those principles are underpin anything we're prepared to do. There is a real lack of clarity about how much 111 implementation is going to slip, because the deadline for applications for slippage is, I believe, the 27th of next month.
Yeah.
Is that right?
That's right.
And then there's going to be some kind of filtering process. And the advice that the Secretary of State is getting now is that it will only be a handful of areas that will slip. But I think that the evidence on which that is based is inevitably somewhat incomplete. So I think we just don't know. But I just want to reassure you and the whole board and the public that we serve that we will only carry on the 0845 service if it's adequately funded and we're confident that we can maintain clinical standards.
And did they give you any sense of how big the sort of remaining population would have to be for them to still want us to continue running?
No, that's all open for discussion.
No.
And there's no time. And sorry, did you say that there is a time?
There is
when they'll be able to tell us that?
No, there is a deadline for applications
Yes.
to be received.
Then there'll be
I'm
time
not
after.
aware of them having committed. So they set a deadline for localities. I'm not aware that they've committed to a deadline for responding. That may be my mistake.
I've got some informal information, but it's probably not appropriate to put in the public domain.
It's probably easier
It's
to set
quite
a
tight.
deadline.
It's quite tight.
Oh, it's a
The timing's quite
tight.
I just had an observation,
Yes,
really.
yes, of course.
I think it's important that we are here for picking up on the services that can't be properly commissioned in the timescale that was originally envisaged, and that's right, we should make that offer. The thing that is also there, depending on the size of what's needed, will be contingency, one assumes, for any possible breakdown in the 111 services that are occurring nationwide. So it's not just for this small, whatever is the residual sort of group of commissioners that aren't taking it forward, but also potentially as a backup. As with all things, and that West I've talked to Louise about, to the chair about earlier, and it's an example of where things can go wrong in transitioning from one service to another. I'm not saying it will do, but obviously that was mentioned in some of the correspondence that I saw.
Well, it's the difference between planned slippage and unplanned.
Yeah, that's what I'm...
And yeah, so
I think the reality, as soon as you have made it plain that there is not an absolute non-negotiable national deadline for the rolling out of the service, then unplanned slippage becomes much more likely as people realise that it's not a P45 moment to have missed the deadline, and that is the reality. I think Could I just mention a couple of things
Yeah,
in response to Trevor? The one point that we have, I think, got agreed with the centre is that however, whatever it does to the funding available to commissioners across the patch, across England, in areas that have or haven't rolled out 111, which is a different question, our funding would come centrally from one source and not from, for example, negotiations with a whole lot of areas that themselves were seeing 111 slip in terms of deadlines. So I think that's an important principle that we will, because the feasibility of being able to negotiate with different areas is extremely doubtful. The second point is that clearly one of the things that is central to the way that we are planning the transition from 084 to 0845 to 111 is that the staff move from 0845 to 111 as the service demand moves from 0845 to 111. We keep those two things in synchronisation, so that the staff who would be continuing to run an 0845 service in that scenario would be staff that hadn't transferred to a new 111 service because that new service hasn't started. So the idea is that we keep those two very much in parallel. I mean, clearly your point is of major importance for staff who are not on the front line and who are not transferring and who are central to maintaining the safety and integrity of the service. And I think that's another dimension. But as Joanne said, we are absolutely clear, and it was reflected in our public statements, that we will look positively on requests to extend the service, but what will be our guiding principle is what's best for patients, which is exactly getting to the point that you raised.
Okay, Nick, would you like to carry on whatever headlines you'd like to draw
Yes,
attention to?
well, staff open forums, we had a fairly good debate, I think, and discussion at the last board meeting, so I'm not sure there's anything else to say. We've had about 1,000 staff actually attend those, which I think is a pretty good batting average. You have in front of you the procurement update, and this is based on all of the procurements that are in the public domain, where the outcomes of the procurements are in the public domain. Pretty much, I think, up to date. I don't think there have been any. Ruth or Trevor will tell me whether there have been any since.
Nick, just there was some confusion, I think, about Outer North East London, but it had actually been announced a while ago.
And those are included in the figures, I think. So, the trend has continued of the majority of services being given, contracts being let to either GP out of hours organisations, ambulance trusts, or a combination of the two. So about 90% have gone in that direction, and obviously we're part of the 10% that hasn't.
Steve?
Just a question regarding other type of organisation. Can you just...
It was an NHS trust. It was the Berkshire Mental Health Trust.
I think it's notable there's no private organisations here at all.
Well, there is one private organisation which is an incumbent out of hours.
Yeah, one of the GP out of hours. Well, the GP out of hours organisations span pure private limited company to social enterprise limited company. So it's sort of a cooperative approach. And clearly Harmony have, of that 13.1%, Harmony are about 8%, and Harmony are privately owned, but they are an incumbent in the out of hours space. It is their main business, but no new entrants from the private sector.
Okay. I'd like to ask a question or make a comment about the trials.
Okay.
Is there anything else you wanted to say?
So I was just meandering my way through the other items. Sorry. Frontline staff transfers. You have what's called the gateway letter, and the gateway process, for those that are not familiar with it, is all formal communications from the Department of Health that have any authority have to go through the gateway and actually have a gateway number. And this is a residue from the time when Uncle Tom Cobley and all decided in the department that they could write out to the NHS and tell them what to do from about 10 years ago. And as a result was confusion and complete lack of clarity about what was needed. So they introduced the gateway process. Conversely, therefore, when things go through the gateway process, they are NHS law, effectively. And it's very pleasing to see that the need to implement the Cabinet Office guidelines has been subject to a gateway letter. And as Roger, I think, can report, it has changed the tenor of most, if not all, of our conversations.
Yes, they are starting to change. The early conversations have still been very, very tortuous indeed, but I hope that the tone of those conversations is starting to change as a result of this.
Trevor?
2 points. First of all, have we resolved the problems in the northeast of England?
No.
Because that was the first tender that was let. It didn't have some of the requirements you would expect from commissioners to the new provider in terms of requiring the transfer of staff. So could you just update us on that one first of all, please?
We are in discussion. I've had agreement from the four chief executives, one director and 4 chief executives, the director of the North, Richard Barker, and 3 chief executives, myself, Simon Featherstone from North East Ambulance, and Yasmin Chowdhury, who's the PCT cluster chief executive. So we are agreed in principle. However, last week we ran into further problems with kind of devil in the detail, although it's actually not detail, it's pretty fundamental. And I'm afraid we're having to go back up the escalation route to get that resolved, and the continuing uncertainty for staff is really deplorable. But that's where we are with the North East. We've made, I think, positive progress with some of the other kind of live transfer discussions, including at the back end of last week, Harmony, who were very clear that they had built this into their business model and that they were absolutely intent on making this work positively. So unfortunately not the North East, but everywhere else we're making good progress.
I must say I find it very disappointing that we have a group of loyal NHS staff who have a significant amount to contribute not being treated well through this process in the North East, in spite of what is very, very clear intent from the Department of Health.
I agree.
My second point was, and this may just be me, when I look at the letter that has gone out, the second of the bullet points setting out the principles, I just can't get my head around what that means. This is following NHS 11 procurements. Commissioners would be required to give specified notice, etc. Could you just explain what the point of that paragraph is?
Okay.
There's about 6 ways you can read that, depending on quite where the commas are meant to be in the statement.
Okay. Grammar's never been, or use of punctuation marks, never been my strong point. But in terms of what it actually means, what I know it to mean is that if you take an area where a 111 service procurement has been completed and a contract is signed with a successful provider by the commissioner, as part of their discussions they agree a go live date for the 111 service.
Yeah.
And then part of the subtext of that is agreement of a precise date and time when that new 111 service will then take on the responsibility for the 0845 calls. That is connected with, coordinated with 2 other aspects. The first is the agreement of the detailed arrangements for the transfer of staff, with the objective of making sure that the staff are in place from the point at which the 0845 call handling responsibility comes into being. So the staff. The second is that we put in arrangements to advise patients from that particular locality that phone 0845 to redial 111 so that we transfer the workload, but in a practical, implementable way. And then the third leg of the stool is agreement between NHS Midlands and East to release funding from the NHS bundle that they use to manage commission the 0845 service to provide that funding to the commissioner of the area for the new 111 service. So those things lock together, and the agreement is that there will be 6 months between the signing of that agreement that essentially agrees a date when all of these things will happen, that there will be 6 months notice between then and the service and staff transfers. In respect to two of the kind of early, whether you call them anomalies or the very early cases in the northeast and in Derbyshire, we have actually agreed transfers earlier than the 6 months because they've been so long in gestation, and that's created problems, and it's certainly not something we want to repeat, because it actually comes unstuck when you go through the consultative process with staff. But we're doing our very best to kind of get over those issues, but that's what the 6 months relates to.
My unease, and that's useful explanation, but it implies there will be a date after 111 has gone live before 0845 transfers across. So you'll have 111 and 0845 running in tandem in areas. When do our staff transfer over under the Cabinet Office guidelines? Is it for the opening of the 111 service or the transfer of the 0845?
Transfer of the 0845. But in practice, we believe that those two dates will be very close together within a matter of a few days.
The slight concern I've got with that is that will not maximise the transfer of NHS staff to the new service in future, because new staff will be appointed for the start of the 111 service, and at some point then extra staff will be transferred into the 111 service to take on the 0845. Potentially that will mean we will be left with staff surplus to requirements with new staff coming into 111. Am I missing something?
Yeah, the thing you're missing, Trevor, and it's absolutely a technical point, if you like, is that as we are following strictly TUPE-like requirements here, what effectively happens when our staff transfer, if there is a surplus of staff at that point, and we absolutely hope there isn't going to be if these things are well planned, but if there was to be, then all the people at that grade in that service would be included in that restructure, not just the people who transfer in from NHS Direct. That is what would happen under TUPE, and this is TUPE to all intents and purposes, so that is what we are expecting to happen in these circumstances.
I don't want to make a big... I understand that. I would have thought the best solution was for our staff to go in at the start of the 111, rather than bringing new staff in to do that. But
then we've got nobody left to run the 0845
that's the problem.
service.
Yes.
But wouldn't it be better for, if extra staff is required, for us to bring temporary staff into 0845? Otherwise, we will have staff who will be made redundant.
We are recruiting temporary staff as much as we possibly can, and of course the critical issue is for nursing staff, and that practically our ability to recruit new staff in to fill an anticipated gap is actually, it's a major concern. So,
but this just reinforces the point we had about extending 0845. We can't have it both ways.
That's the point.
I mean, what it illustrates is the complexity of a decommissioning of an existing service and ramping up a new one.
Yeah.
And there are multiple issues of that nature.
Absolutely.
I would suggest, and I think it's been useful to take the lid off and look at that one in particular. There'll be many others,
Yes.
and there will be further conversations that are already being had. And if board members are interested in delving into it in more detail, I'm sure the executive are happy to involve them.
Very wise.
Yes, but it's an exceptionally complicated transition.
Yeah, it is.
Tim.
Just to add, I mean, are we going to get the job of coordinating all this by default, or have we discussed with the department that some coordination might be appropriate from elsewhere?
We have two levels of coordination. The most recently implemented was a more senior governance group overseeing the transition from 0845 to 111. And that is now chaired by a senior NHS chief executive, John McIver, who's the Chief Executive from Lincolnshire, Chief Executive of Lincolnshire, and it involves senior officials from within the department and NHS Midlands and East. And then we have a more nuts and bolts group that includes staff from within the 111 programme who are overseeing 111 rollouts, as well as ourselves, Midlands and East, and the department. But that's much more the kind of nuts and bolts level. So the question is, will those groups make the kind of overall decisions and directions that enable us to stick to the principles outlined in the Gateway letter, or not? And certainly you can imagine that this Chief Executive is very keen on making sure that we stick to those principles.
Yeah, okay. And those groups see their role as doing that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Nick, can I interject a follow-up question to that? What about where we are on the public consultation for decommissioning of 0845? Is that something that group is also taking responsibility for?
Back in November last year, I wrote querying whether the legal requirements, which are commissioner requirements, have been considered. Clearly, as an employer, we have consultation requirements for us in terms of our staff, and those are statutory. There are similar statutory consultation requirements that rest upon the shoulders of commissioners. And I have raised that with Midlands and East and with the department, and they are currently considering the issue.
Thank you.
I think the only thing I just wanted to say is I thought this letter is as strong a letter as you could ever see.
I agree.
Regarding accountability of the commissioners for implementing 111 and the decommissioning of 0845 and safeguarding our staff's interests.
Yep.
And that's what we aim for, that's what you've got, so I think we should acknowledge that's very good.
Absolutely,
indeed.
completely agree.
And I think, again, I just wanted to say this, that external auditors would be directed to a letter like this to ensure that all the commissioners have fulfilled their obligations.
It's just a shame it wasn't written in November last year.
I agree. But it's very strong.
I agree, completely agree.
Okay. Thank you.
So the final two items are kind of trailing our coat for what is yet to come. The first is the trial in Luton, which is continuing, of redirecting our callers from 0845 through 111. In this particular instance, we are not asking them to redial, we are actually redirecting the calls. And that's an important distinction. But it's obviously aimed at identifying what the impact is when you do that, in terms of ongoing referrals for those cases. We've agreed, and I think quite understandably with the department, that we won't comment publicly on the significant results of that trial until such time as they've been through the statistical machine to make sure that we're all satisfied that they are statistically robust, as it would be a matter of some interest to those that, including ourselves, that have said that we are concerned that the impact hasn't been thought through and that there might be an unplanned increase. So that's why we haven't made any public comment, and wouldn't intend to do so until we've got bigger into the DH about the results.
Louisa.
I just wondered, so when people call, are they told this is what's happening, and do they want to take part in that?
No. Tricia, in terms of consent, no, they're not.
No,
They're
they're not.
put through to the new 111 system.
There is an IVR message which instructs them there is a 111 service in their area and the call will be transferred through.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean it's no different to we don't obtain consent for patients who are put through to the 111 service in any of the areas where 0845 also exists in the pilots.
I suppose they think they're calling 08.
So do the people in the 111 areas.
I just wanted to express some disquiet, I suppose. I mean, this is the second month that we've been aware of the Sheffield report, being available in draft and not being shared. We've always been saying, from relatively early on, it's vital that the people who are commissioning these new 111 services have all the insight they possibly can from pilots. It's very disappointing not to see the Sheffield report shared with them. And whereas I understand the logic of what you're describing, Nick, and I did see it in the clinical governance minutes that we are not going to publicise the Luton trial results until the steering group has approved it. That does again lead me to some concern that there may be an extended delay on that, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are.
Clearly, has there been an extended delay? No, only insofar as getting the trial underway. But it started on the 9th of May. I forget the number of calls daily. Trish, you might have some better estimate of that.
It's in the region of 300 calls per day.
So, since the 9th of May, we've been notching up 300 0845 calls per day going through the 111 system. And it's a question for a statistician how many calls you need to get through in order to be able to be statistically robust.
It's about the delay that there might be between the evaluation of the statistics and making those public, because that's what we've got with the Sheffield report.
I understand that, but the point I'm making is I don't think we have yet reached the point where we are delaying the production of valid statistics, but we are very aware of that, very alert to that, and certainly I would be pushing for that information to be made publicly available just as soon as there are statistically satisfactory results available.
And do we have a date for the publication of the Sheffield report?
My understanding is that a revised draft is going to be circulated to the 111 programme in early July, and that it will then take 2 to 3 weeks, which takes you just about, I think, to the deadline for the extension of 111 services applications for the report to be published. So end of July is my revised understanding of when it's likely to be published.
That seems most unfortunate.
Yes.
Well, if you're of the view that the Sheffield report will help people make up their mind and therefore reduce the number of people who will feel that they need to apply for an extension because they don't have the results, yes, I agree. I think it would be very helpful for those commissioners who were unsure about what the new service was going to do to have that information available to them.
Most unfortunate. Fine. Any other questions to the Chief Executive? Thank you, Nick. Then let's move on to the corporate performance package, which Trevor will navigate us through as usual.
Thank you, Chair. Headlines for May. Access to our service remained good. 93% of patients and users were able to reach a call handler within 60 seconds for 0845 services and 98% for 111 service. We had abandonment rates of just 2% for our 0845 service and 0.4% for 111. Also worth noting, as previously discussed, there is a significant difference between the level of completion rates within NHS Direct for 0845 services, which were 52%, compared to 111 services of just 27%. I'd like to confirm for the board that our health and symptom checker usage was 399,000 completed uses against a target of 322,000. Our biggest challenge remains staff nurse numbers, having the right numbers of nurses on at the right times, and that continues to impact on the less and non-urgent clinical call performance, and equally on the volumes of calls that we can safely take into the service. That said, patient satisfaction remains very good at 90%, and our level of complaints are extremely low. I'll pause at that point for comments, discussion and questions.
Thanks, Trevor. Does anyone have any comments on this? I do. Sue will go first.
Just about the nurse recruitment and the the health advisors. I was looking at the fulfilment of capacity plan. Mine is 17% on nurses and 24% on health advisors. You talked about nurses, and obviously that's a continuing problem, but What's actually happening with the health advisors?
Yeah, that number doesn't include what we use with conduit. That's a substantive number. So about between 35 and 40% of our staff is now with conduit, and that's increasing. So that doesn't include the conduit number.
Oh.
That's just our substantive number.
So if you were to add in the conduit
Then that would
flexibility,
then that would actually be in the order of 0 to 10% over.
okay, but that number's just going to get worse, isn't it? Because we're going to need to have more.
We
temporary
clearly need
staff.
to be showing the picture to the
Yeah.
boards
Absolutely.
of
That's not really
including
helpful,
all
is
of our
it?
health
Yeah.
advisor. I didn't realise that, so
We'll work with the team and recalibrate how that measure's put together.
because what we're trying to answer here is, do we have enough health advisors
Exactly.
and do we have enough nurse advisors
Yes.
to do the job?
Yes.
That's what this is trying to get at. And if we only include our permanent staff for health advisors, it gives a misleading picture, because as you said, it'll just look worse and worse, won't it?
Indeed.
It is the same for nurses.
Oh, so the nurse number is not as bad as that?
Well, we are topping up our permanent nurse numbers through agencies, so
Okay, all right.
same plan.
So the message on that is the fulfilment chart, which is the last one, hasn't quite got to the point where it tells us what we need to know.
No.
Yeah. So we need to. So I was pretty unclear about it too. So we're going to go back and look at that again.
But there has been an issue with health advisors, and I wonder if Keith wants to just talk about it in terms of conduit fulfilment.
We had an issue with conduit for about a 3 to 4 week period from middle of May to middle of June. We have a daily requirement of conduit in terms of number of hours that they need to fulfil, and that needs to be matched against the requirement that we have. Unbeknown either to us or to Conduit's own UK management, they had corporately moved their rostering team offshore to the Philippines, and they had made some substantial changes to the roster patterns, so we were considerably overstaffed with Conduit staff in the mornings when we didn't really need them, and considerably understaffed in the evenings, which is when we use them to fill up. That's been escalated to European CEO level with Conduit. The American Chief Operating Officer has been taking a personal lead on that, and we've been assured that from today the situation will be rectified. We've also had a written apology from Conduit for that failure.
And who carries the cost for us being oversupplied at times when we don't?
We carry the cost in terms of our contract with East of England. We do have KPI failure penalties with Conduit. This however won't invoke those, because those penalties are calculated on a daily basis. So on a daily basis they were within the schedule. One thing that is quite common in these arrangements, which we've not had in the past, and I have put Conduit on notice that this is how we are likely to move, is that we will move them to an hourly fulfilment, and the KPI will be based on an hourly basis.
I think Conduit UK management were exceedingly embarrassed by this, and Keith and I are meeting their new executive responsible for their European outfit, who's coming over, and we're meeting them face to face either this week or next. And I'm sure that the written apology is reinforcing their embarrassment, but the tone of their conversation with us about how we want to ensure that the contract in future will penalise them financially should this occur again, I suspect that they will be entirely understanding about why we're going to have that conversation, and the fact that we're having this conversation in open session in our board for the whole world to see will equally spur them into action, I think.
Surely it's about making sure that we have matched penalty arrangements.
That's right.
So at the moment what you're saying is that we're exposed because we can incur penalties which we're not able to recoup from our suppliers.
Well, broadly, our penalties run on a daily basis as well, but we rely on Conduit at particular times of the day,
To meet that.
and that's what we will be looking to time.
Louisa.
I just wondered, did you say, Keith, maybe you did? I mean, how quickly would we notice something like this?
We noticed it in the numbers in about 3 to 4 days. It took about another 3 to 4 days, maybe 5, for either Conduit or ourselves to work out exactly what the issue was, because as I say, the Conduit managers weren't aware this had happened either, so they were a bit flummoxed themselves.
Tim.
Curious, I was pleased to see the B14 roster efficiency target being more or less met, but then struggle to understand why we then still struggle with the time to urgent assessment, non-urgent assessment and least urgent assessment.
Numbers of nurses.
It's the volume of nurses that we have.
What do you mean then by roster efficiency?
So roster efficiency is it's quite technical, but at build there is a demand shape of calls that come in, and that roster efficiency at build is how closely that matches, but that is done on the basis of a full establishment, which we don't currently
So you can have a consistently under-fulfilled requirement, so you've got less nurses on, but you're using the nurses that you do have as efficiently as possible.
Yeah. And so that feeds into B15, which is the schedule adherence being short.
Yes. So schedule adherence. You'll notice from B15, schedule adherence has improved massively from this time last year, and that has been certainly through February, March, April, one of the primary focuses of our staff. Schedule adherence is a measure of if we provide a roster for a member of staff, it's how closely they work to that roster. So it's about if we need someone to be logged in at 9:30, it's logged in, it's when they take their breaks, when they come back, etc. Now, our target is 90%. For health advisors, we are actually running about 91-92%. And for our health information and dental nurses, about 91-92%. For nurse advisors, it's about 82%, and that's where we're focusing. So that brings out an average of about 86.5%, but it's particularly with pockets of the nurses where we're targeting that action.
With the improvement, Ben, with the improvement in roster efficiency and so forth, why have we in fact got worsening time to assessments?
Because again, we are still under establishment on nurse numbers.
Are we more under establishment on nurse numbers?
We're answering more calls. We're also answering more calls.
We are bringing more calls in.
Are we?
Not as many as we had hoped, but we are answering more calls.
Okay.
Trevor.
Bringing this together with the finance section, you'll see from there we're actually overspending because we're over the capacity plan on the health advisor side, which means we're able to bring more patients and users into the service, but unfortunately that puts more of a strain on the limited capacity that we have in the clinical side.
Sorry, just one more nail. The approach that we take is that it is better for us to answer all of the calls that we have, and even if, because we are answering all the calls we have, it means that our achievement of the time to clinical assessment for the lower priority patients is not as good, than to appear squeaky clean in answering, in doing time to assessment, but effectively disappointing people at the front door by having long waits for the call to be answered in the first place. So we have got the strategy of opening our doors as wide as we can to answer as many of the calls as we can. And this year we were targeting to answer about 650,000 more calls this year than last year, but to use the tactic of clinical prioritization to make sure that it was patients with much lower priority needs that were the ones who had to wait longest for the nurse assessments.
Peter, thank you.
Just checking on that. It's just that the less urgent 60s seem to not have such a good deal as the non-urgent 120s. Is there what's that all about then? If we're prioritising,
refer that more difficult question to Tricia or Keith.
The P3 calls, when they come into the service, when they're assessed, many of those are closed down by the health advisor with some supporting interim or home care advice. So they are actually not brought fully into the service. It's the P2s whose need isn't urgent as an emergency, but still needs a clinical assessment, that are continuously brought into the service.
It's just that the bar chart just doesn't reflect. Perhaps, I don't know. It doesn't look right.
So it looks as though we may not be perhaps allocating our nurse resource in quite the most effective way, because what we're saying is we're doing better with the non-urgent 120s than the less urgent 60s. Could we come back to that next month and understand that a bit more? Because unless it's very clear, do you want to have another go, Trish?
Yeah, they're not going. The P3s are not going to nurses. They're being closed at the front door by the health advisors.
What, the non-urgent in 120?
Yes. Yeah.
Why?
So should they be in that bucket at all?
Yes.
Why are they in a 120 bucket if they're being closed down?
Because we have a
immediately?
KPI to achieve the end of a call, including the assessment, within 120. So we report on the KPI. The fact that that assessment can be completed without it having to go to a nurse more than the P2s
so it doesn't work then. That's not a good KPI.
No. Okay. I think that makes it somewhat difficult to interpret the chart. I don't think we need to go any further.
Thank you.
Louisa.
I might just 3 small points. I spent ages looking for the 111 target here on B20, B23, this page here. And Peter very kindly pointed out that there wasn't one, and I wasn't going mad. And of course, I suppose it's that there isn't a 111 target for calls not requiring onward referral. And it made me think,
yeah, exactly.
And it made me think, well,
So
maybe we should remove that. But on a deeper level, whether
that's the whole point
exactly,
that we've been making.
Exactly.
Yes.
Whether we could ever imagine that there would be.
Well, if we can't, that should be clearer. I agree. Can we take that away? And if you can't take it off the chart, put a note saying, no, there is no target for onward referral. Keith?
Yes.
Just to hopefully wrap that up, as we've rehearsed before, and it's clear from the numbers we've been through and our risk register that most of these issues come down to our lack of establishment with nurse numbers. We are working very, very intensively with all our partners. So we brought in about 30 FTE in May and about 23 FTE in June. We have similar numbers forecasted come in between July and November. The requirement was to get to 200 FTE new nurses by November, and the latest forecast that was shared with me on Friday is we are on track to do that.
Thanks, Keith. I'd like to make a couple of, ask a question and make a comment. So my question is there a simple explanation for the drop in 111 call numbers, volumes in May? Is that a pilot switched off, or that's so B17?
Yeah, I'm not aware of any specific issue that's been identified.
Suspected seasonal.
Okay, so does it reflect our own call volumes?
Slightly different because we're trying to take more calls into the 0845 service.
Okay, yeah,
but
so there's another variable.
Generally the summer is a little bit quieter.
Yeah. There was some significant advertising in the north in the launch of their 111 service. Whether that's now reduced and had the impact.
Okay. So I mean, it does look as though it's Lancashire. Okay, fine. And then the observation I wanted to make, presumably part of these, with the performance issues, and then it must at some level be related to sickness, because sickness takes people out of the system. And I guess it's disappointing but not surprising that sickness should be travelling in the wrong direction for an organisation in the situation in which we find ourselves.
Yes, that's true, Chair, and we talked about it at the last meeting, and it's risen since then. However, you will find in the next board meeting that it will have come down significantly. Actually, it peaked at 8.3% in the last week of May, actually, and it has come down sharply, actually, in the first 3 weeks of June to 7.5, 7.2, and in the last week commencing 17th of June to 6.9. So that takes us down to somewhere between March and February levels, and is sort of almost back to a more normal level. So I think we've had a very significant rise over 3 months, which has equally significantly fallen in the last 3 weeks. Okay. So I think we can relate, as we always say in relation to sickness, we are not a robust organisation. So when things happen to us of a kind of traumatic nature, be it flu or the sort of events that have happened over the last few months, our staff, there is a rise in sickness, but I'm really pleased to say that it's starting to come down significantly over the last few weeks.
Steve?
Just on that note though, the number of people on long-term sick seems to have taken a very big rise, which is, you're giving quite a big focus on that. So
yeah, and we still are focusing on that. I think I'll wait until the numbers come out for this month to see whether that is accompanying the fall. It may not be, in which case we may have to take further action on long-term sick. But I want to see if it falls first before we decide on any new action on that. Steve.
Okay, thank you very much. Shall we then move on to the finance package? Back to you, Trevor.
We ended the month ahead of our financial plan for the year to date. We have a surplus of £666,000 and cash balances of £21.4 million. Clearly it's a promising start to what will be a particularly difficult and challenging year, and we must continue to carefully track, monitor and manage our finances over the coming months. Happy to take any questions.
Any questions for Trevor on the money? No, thank you, Trevor. Admirably clear, good position. That's great. All right. Sarah, shall we then move on to the corporate risk register?
Yeah, sure. The corporate risk register has been reviewed and updated again. We currently have 7 entries in the public version of the register. We have 1 red risk, and this risk has increased this month following partnership discussions across England, which Nick has just discussed in his chief exec's report.
I would just like to, before if indeed we do have a discussion about this, to observe that it's extremely difficult for a risk register to keep up with events that are moving as fast as ours are. So I think we may not feel that, at this point when we're extremely focused on these risks on a week-by-week, possibly day-by-day basis, that this instrument becomes less of a leading indicator and more of a lagging indicator, to be honest.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah.
I think that's the nature of the instrument.
Yeah, we are trying to rectify that. We're looking at bringing fortnightly reporting in the future as opposed to monthly reporting at the exec meetings. Let's try and give a more current picture at board meetings.
Thanks, Sarah. That's great. Any questions for Sarah? Tim?
Thank you. Looking at the second one, patient experience implementation of 111. I was looking through all the documentation of the discussions in the Department of Health over the last few weeks, and the issue of dental nurses I don't think has been included in any of the communications that we've got back. Okay. With the dental nurses situation not being addressed, I'm a bit surprised that the risk has remained the same since the last assessment, because at the last assessment we were trying to insert that into the specification. I assume that's not happened. So I would have thought that would have got worse because there's quite a big impact from that.
We, just as a matter of record, we are in discussion with the Department of Health about the future of dental nurses, and pointing out that as things currently are playing out, 111 services are not including additional dental assessment such as that which requires a dental nurse. And are they satisfied that that is the position and don't require any kind of fallback service from the dental nurses we currently employ, and that is under active discussion.
Okay, it feels like amber with a tinge of red then, I guess.
Well, I think the patient experience metric is a broader judgment than simply the excruciating pain as pain from the tooth is. There's an awful lot of patients without toothache who are satisfied.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. And thank you, Tim. Okay. If there aren't any more questions or comments on the risk register, we are, of course, I should have said, in the governance and compliance section of the agenda now. We can then move on to our first set of feedback, committee feedback. We have here the agenda, which, Peter, I guess is your, so that we can hear what you, so we can see what you talked about, and you can maybe highlight anything that you think we need to know about in advance of the approved minutes, which will come next time.
Well, we had quite a detailed discussion about the annual report and accounts last time at the special meeting.
Yeah.
So I wasn't intending to pursue that. I think the other thing just to note is that we do receive sort of an annual report from each of the sort of main arms of audit that we monitor through the course of the year, and this was the meeting where those things happened. I think I just wanted to mention under the health and safety that we had kept a strong eye on fire training and fire precaution work, and I can say that the level of readiness and activity has gone up considerably during the course of the year, and the executive have taken strong action to monitor that, and so we're pleased as an audit committee that that activity has happened. And the only other thing to report on, I think, is also on the financial focus section on the payroll activities. Salary overpayments have been something which has come to the board from time to time, and there was a very detailed review by the internal auditors of the pay arrangements, which showed that a lot of progress had been made, but there is a very significant review process by the executive at NHS Direct that now reviews all overpayments or payment processes as we're going along, and quite strong action is taken to put it right at the prime moment it occurs, if it does occur. And I think that activity has improved the local manager's ability to get things right first time. Mm-hmm. It's something which we, as an audit committee, have strongly mentioned through Nick to the general management process, and I think that that has borne fruit, and improvements have been made.
Thank you, Peter.
But other than that, nothing else covered to report.
Well, I'm guessing that you'll be happy to take any questions people might have on the annual report, which was
yes, which is
included.
Yes.
Does anyone have any questions on the audit committee meeting or annual report?
No, thank you.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you to the committee. I mean, there's been an enormous amount of work in the last
My colleagues worked extremely hard, and I thank them greatly for their support.
Excellent. Okay. So we've got some updates here for the corporate governance manual. I think we might just do this by questions, mightn't we? So questions to any one of, I guess, Trevor, Sarah, Keisha. Great, thank you. Well, I think we can approve then those changes to the corporate governance manual. That's great.
Nicely done.
Nicely done. Yes, actually, very clear. Yes, thank you. And slender and clear. So that's both of which we have really appreciated.
Even better.
We have some clinical governance committee meeting notes. Mm-hmm. You fed back to us about the meeting. So I guess we can just take questions. Yep. I think I've raised the only comment that I had, which is a question about the potential delay in reporting the results of the Luton trial. But you've covered that off. Yep, for me, thank you. Anything else to say? No? Fine. We then went on to item 12, the terms of reference from the remuneration committee?
That's me.
That's you.
The terms of reference have been updated in line with our new corporate model template for all terms of reference. The terms of reference have also been to the remuneration committee for approval, and I'm now bringing them to the board for full approval.
Trevor, so we can assume you have indeed approved these. At the
Changes in style, not content.
Okay, lovely. Thank you. And then we have a similar, slightly different set of changes to terms of reference from the Innovation Committee. Is that the same process? Same process. So Tim, you're happy with those?
Yes, I am, thank you.
Any questions on those for anyone? Okay, so those are approved. Thank you very much. I think if people are happy, we'll just move on to, because we've got a relatively short section coming up on stakeholder engagement. There have been some trust board engagement visits out and about, mostly connected to open forums, I think. Would anyone like to open on those? Or I can?
No,
Keith and I spent a day at Chatham. So Chatham's an interesting site because they have the appointments line as well as other functions. I mean, staff were very engaged. The differences in level, I think, of breadth of interest. So some interests were very much about individuals, and some, I think, showed a greater appreciation of the overall picture. Of course, since then we've had a 111 bid outcome in that part of the world. Is that right?
Yes, South East Coast.
So that will
went to
have
the
an
Ambulance
impact.
Trust.
It does. And so that will have an impact, obviously, on Chatham as a site, and that was one of the things that was obviously uppermost in people's minds. Keith, can I just ask Keith about the evening one, because I didn't go to that. Did you have an evening session?
Yeah, I did have an evening session, very similar to the morning one. Again, useful for people to have the context. The questions that came up were fairly typical of ones that I'd seen elsewhere, but again, particularly around the appointments line and South East bid for Chatham, which we did not have a decision on at the time. That's subsequently do have a decision on that now, and the heads of performance are going through the communications process with staff in Chatham last week and this week. But again, a very good session. I also had one in Chelmsford last Saturday, which was the last face-to-face one, and in Nantwich by video conference last Saturday, which was the last one. And again, all been very positive and constructive. People, the general feeling from me is that people have appreciated the honesty, and they've appreciated us being open and honest with them now at this stage, rather than talking to them at some point in the future.
So my question was just, which Keith partially answered then, which is when, as soon as it's heard that somebody else has won the tender, what our sort of comms package is, and also I suppose, how the staff are responding to that, and so it's because in a way you almost feel that it'd be good to have the open forum event almost, again afterwards. No, okay, no, we're not doing that. But.
I think one of the things that we have observed, which is consistent, is that the process of handling the communications from the point at which a decision is made and communicated to the parties by the awarding PCTs or cluster to the point at which the legal standstill process within the contract has been completed, and the planning for when the communication or the decision made by the PCT is going to be made public is usually chaotic. Not sensitive to the fact that there are several hundred people, if not more, in all of the different providers who have a personal interest, and it's treated as if it's another corporate decision about the price of fish. I'm saying the price of fish is not important, but you get my drift. It's not treated with the courtesy and the respect that it's due, and it drives me to distraction. And if I could get a single message across to PCT chief executives who are in charge of this process, that if they would like their staff treated in the same way, I would happily oblige.
So So the answer is that we do have a communications that goes out.
Yes,
But
but the
it's- has
timing
got
of it,
caveats and-
sorry, I'm getting overwhelmed by the emotion of it, but
No,
the
it's
timing of it is hugely problematic, because on the one hand we have our knuckles wrapped for communicating through the wrong channels at the wrong point during a legal standstill period, and then the same commissioners with gay abandon will make public information that we would like dearly to tell our staff before they read it in the newspapers, or a passing ambulance person tells them in the street, and they fail to take any notice of us, which is aggravating to say the least.
Okay. I suppose it is yet another unintended consequence of a major transition of service, and reflects the way in which procurements are handled.
Yeah.
So I suppose I'm rather clumsily asking if
How we
we're
look
confident
after.
that we're doing as much as we can to support our staff
I think,
after those decisions are made.
I think we're doing the best we can in extremely difficult circumstances. Written communications to staff who are affected, almost instantaneous to when we know that the information is public, with follow-up face-to-face briefings for managers and staff, so that everyone's in the picture as soon as possible, but with a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week service with lots of part-timers, you don't catch everybody, not everybody has access to their email, etc., etc. So, it is a difficult process, and I guess we just have to rely upon the continuing common sense of our staff, that they know it's difficult, and that we're doing the best we can to keep them up to date.
Trevor?
I attended meetings sort of before the last board meeting, but I didn't get here, so I'd report back on those. I went to Bristol for 2 meetings with Nick, and I'd just like to say how impressed I was by how mature and professional the staff were attending the meetings, and how open Nick was with them. After the formal presentations, there was a very, very high quality and mature debate around the issues. I must say it left me quite a profound effect on me, thinking just sort of what the service is doing to those staff at the moment, and how we as a board need to think about how we can keep even closer to them. Certainly those meetings, I think, will have helped tremendously the relationship between senior management and the staff at the coalface through a difficult period.
I'm going to go back to the meeting, and then I haven't forgotten you.
I'm just going to, that sort of struck me. I wasn't here last time, but I noticed my comments, and I was really struck, really impressed. Spoken about it since to people about just the incredible sort of, I think, compassion of the staff who sometimes seem more concerned about the effect on patients than the effect on them personally. Yeah. I thought the quality of our staff, as ever, was extraordinary.
It's really good to hear, and I'm glad that in the context of the board we recognise those things.
Yeah.
Because it is extraordinarily difficult for people. But both in senior management roles, trying to manage and support people through the process, and for staff who are having to absorb the impact on themselves, their lives, and their families. Alan.
Yeah, just to mention the visit that Tim and I made to the Stafford call centre for an open forum. Very well attended by staff there, well supported by the operations management team. I detected a little bit of scepticism, I think, in the audience before the session started, but we had a very constructive conversation. I think the slides were well received, and one or two sort of mentions of how the audience appreciated the sort of honest presentation of where we are now, whilst recognising that there's still an awful lot of uncertainty.
Okay.
Yes.
Is there anything else? No.
After Tricia.
Oh, Trish, sorry.
I attended the Kendal site, one of our northern sites, and many of the staff came in their own time on the Saturday afternoon to receive that presentation. And they were, so that's a good 6 weeks since we started it, so they were still pleased that we'd made the effort to go up and share the presentation with them in an open and constructive way. They equally were grateful that we had given the time to be open and transparent with them, and they were expressing their disappointment in the future of the 111 service, that it won't provide patients with less acuity symptoms, or just health information inquiries with perhaps the same level of service that they receive, and they very much had the patient in the focus of their comments that they've given back.
It's inevitable, I think, that our staff who have worked so hard, many of them for a long time, in developing this service should feel an acute sense of loss.
Yeah.
And I think that's not a criticism of what's coming ahead. It's just an inevitable sense of loss and separation almost from what they've been doing. Thank you. Okay.
Two very quick things as a follow-up. The first is that as a result of recognising both the value of this and how difficult it is for some staff to be allowed time offline, we've taken the decision that for future events, and that was the second thing I was going to say, we will pay staff additional hours to come in, so that we try and remove the kind of rock and hard place position that we find many people find themselves in terms of being able to get offline. So that was one thing I was mentioning. The other is that I'm sure that we will need to do a repeat series in September and early October to repeat the process of communication once we've got a much clearer picture, rather than going and explaining all of the things that remain uncertain. Hopefully in September and early October we'll be in a position to explain how things are.
Well, accompanied very possibly by something more formal as well, because by the middle of September we need to be preparing for the decommissioning of Eric.
Okay, thank you. We don't have a call recording this month, so we can move to the closing stages. Any other business from anyone? Not at this stage. Our next meeting will be held on the 23rd of July at 10:30 here. Is that right? 10:30. When's the AGM?
Can you ask that question? I think we're doing it for the first hour.
10:30.
Okay.
Board meeting.
So there'll be an AGM.
10:30 to 11:30 will be the AGM, and then obviously a short break, the board meeting straight away afterwards.
Thank you. Well, that brings to an end the open part of our board meeting today. If anybody's with us online, perhaps they'd be kind enough to fill in an evaluation form. I think we're going to close now and break till midday, and then we will convene again in private session. Thanks everyone.
Good.